I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story, where I consult, teach, coach, and speak on the applied science and bewitchery of brand and business storytelling, so that you can clarify your story to amplify your impact and simplify your life.
I thought it was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But after hearing that story, I had to have it. Now I wasn't just buying a picture. I was buying a story. Story literally made the picture worth more money to me.
That's what businesses are about. People buy brands. People buy stories much more than anything else.
I work with a lot of big enterprise companies, but let's just say I always tell folks, drop the PowerPoint, close your laptops, start with your story.
If you want people to get engaged and you want people to act, you have to tell them an emotionally powerful story. That's with great characters, it's with uncertain outcomes, and it's with high stakes and drama.
All business strategy is a story.
Hi, and welcome back to the Business of Story. Park Howell here, and it is so much fun to have you here because we have a special guest who is making his third appearance on the Business of Story. Now, a couple of years ago, we got on the show and talked about the day after Trump got elected, his narrative intuition that got him elected. And with that, we had Dr. Randy Olson here. And I got to tell you, he was working at NASA at the time with some scientists teaching them the and, but, and therefore and story structure. And I called Randy up. I said, Randy, you were right. The Dems lost it for lack of a story. Here you got this reality TV show guy, came out, beat all the pundits, beat all the Democrats, beat everybody, and is now sitting in the highest seat in the land. He's basically our brander-in-chief. And Randy first pushed back and said, no, I don't want to come on the show. I'm too pissed off. And I said, no, exactly. That's why we need to have you on the show. And he did. And I can tell you that show we did directly following the election is our number one downloaded and listened to show after 160 shows here at Business of Story. Not only because it was timely, but it was so fascinating to study how Trump was using this narrative intuition to win over the White House. Now, I can also tell you, after all of these episodes, it's the very first one and only show that I actually received hate mail on. People were saying, why are you out here glorifying Donald Trump and what he's doing? And I can tell you, folks, we weren't glorifying anybody. We were simply stating the facts and revealing what he was doing through his storytelling. My argument in this is you have to understand the magic if you're going to combat the spell. And I can tell you, ever since then, it has been an absolute magic show in the White House without how he comes out and he tells stories. His narrative intuition is beyond good. It's great coming from his personality, his reality TV shows, his background in popular culture and popular entertainment. Now, here we are, just sitting a day or two after the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, everything that went through that and his final confirmation into the Supreme Court. So I reached out to Dr. Olson and I asked, would you come back? What have you learned in the last year and a half of Trump being in office? And how did it even play itself out and what happened in the Kavanaugh hearing? And even more so, how is it playing itself out in the midterm elections? And so Randy gladly said, yes, he would be here. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to welcome back to the show, Dr. Randy Olson, the revealer of the and, but, and therefore probably the single most powerful narrative storytelling tool you will ever use. Randy, welcome to the show.
Great to be here again. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And I think I heard in what you just said, the title of the book that you and I have to write eventually. The title is For Lack of a Story, the Democratic Party in the 2000s.
For lack of a story, the war was lost.
Yes.
You're so right. You're so right.
I think you scored a bullseye with that phrase, for lack of a story. Oh, my God.
Oh, that is fantastic. Now, Randy, it's great to have you back here. I've got to let my listeners know that Randy and I have become fast friends around storytelling over the past 3 or so years. He wrote a book called Connection. And when I was just pivoting away from my ad agency and really getting into consulting, teaching around the world on the power of story, I read Randy's book on connection, and I could see that we were kindred souls here. But that was the first time I had seen the ABT. And I at first thought, it's too simple. Could it really possibly work? But then when I went through and read the rest of the book, and Randy was kind enough to get on the phone, and then he and I have had several conversations since, and I use the ABT now in everything I do, that it is literally the storytelling dumbbell. I say I use it every single day, and I coach my folks to use it every single day to grow their narrative intuition. But what just happened, Randy? What just happened to us with the Brett Kavanaugh and the stories that the Republicans are telling and how they're beating the hell out of the Democrats?
Well, I'm actually dead serious on that title. You just landed a bullseye, for lack of a story, and I'll give you 3 story points along the way. First one is 2012, the quote I think that we used in that Trump episode we did 2 years ago, the quote from Obama, who, when he was asked at the end of his first term, what was the biggest failure of your first term? He said, it was my failure to tell a story to the American people. And this is the job of the president, basically. And it was great how he articulated that. I think he must have been coached in advance of doing that interview. So their story point number 1 is Obama pointing that out, that even as the commander in chief, he was not so good at telling story. Story point number 2 was the tragedy of the Democratic Party getting behind a candidate who didn't tell a story. You know, she was a great policy wonk, but she was not any good at this crucial element of telling a story, basically, of what you stand for and what you're all about. And now we're at point number 3, which is this Kavanaugh hearing, where the Democratic senators, 10 of them in the hearing, failed to tell a story that day with their performance. And I did a blog post on it last week where I just used these narrative tools to kind of show that there was an absence of any strategy in that day. It's really sad and tragic when you study the transcript of everything that was said. You had 10 different senators all just taking pot shots all over the place. And what I, in this blog post, ran through was really how I would have liked to have seen it unfold in a perfect world, where that morning there would have been some sort of leader, a narrative coach or something, that pulled the 10 of them together in a room and began by saying, all right, we need to tell a story basically to the American people about this guy, Brett Kavanaugh, in these 3 hours that we've got for this hearing this afternoon. And we need a theme. Who's got an idea for a theme? And Mazie Hirono would have eventually said, it's about temperament, because she said that eventually in her questions. And she was on NPR that morning and talking about it. And then ideally they would have all instantly sat up and said, you're right. That's a really perfect theme that we can wind everything together in. Okay, let's agree on temperament. Here's what we're going to do. Okay, Feinstein, you're first. You're going to lead this thing off. We need to have a beginning, a middle, and end to this hearing this afternoon. So you're going to begin it by setting up the context. You're going to explain to the American people what temperament is, why it's a crucial quality in being a Supreme Court judge. And these are the sorts of things that are needed. And these are the sorts of things that will disqualify you in terms of temperament. Then each of you, as you pursue your line of questioning, you're going to keep messaging around this term temperament. You're going to keep coming back to it. These quotes from his high school yearbook, and all these little anecdotes and stories, these all illustrate the absence of this sort of temperament. And by the way, Mazie Hirono, sadly, was the only one that really saw the bigger, broader picture, which was, she said on NPR that morning that I'm not that interested in these accusations of back when he was 17. I'm interested in the long-term pattern we can see in his track record as a judge. He doesn't have the temperament. And that was the bigger picture story they should have put together. And by the end of the thing, Harris was the last one. She should have had the assignment of wrap it all up in your last 2 or 3 minutes, pull it all together, touch back, come full circle back to we started this afternoon by talking about temperament. Now you can see. And by the way, they were handed a gift. Had they had that as a game plan, he fell right into the trap when he started talking about the left-wing conspiracy and the Clintons and everything. That was a demonstration live that he didn't have the temperament to be a judge. And they could have finished with that as their core central story message. And all the media would have then messaged around that. All the articles would have had that in their headline. A lot of them did after the fact. And when you search these keywords, Kavanaugh and temperament, you see a lot of them wrote about it afterwards. But had they thought this through even a few days before the hearing, they could have been planting that in advance of it, saying, this is our number one concern is temperament. But it's about having that one word. And that's where there's just apparently this absence of narrative intuition in the entire party.
Yeah, and that was my thought when you mentioned temperament. That in watching the hearing, and we all saw him come completely unglued. That was the first time I thought to myself, "Well, man, this dude doesn't have the temperament to be a Supreme Court justice." But you're telling me the Dems had kind of arrived at that as being one of the push points early on. So, but they just didn't focus on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And they just don't think in these terms. But, one of the fundamental techniques in storytelling in screenplays is called plant and payoff. And all great movies, or not all, but lots and lots of great movies, you see this technique. Just watch Back to the Future. It's one of the all-time exercises in plant and payoff. You get to see all these things early on that are planted. You don't really quite know why they're there. And they get paid off later in the story as they resurface, like, oh, I see the connection. And that's what they essentially would have been doing. Had they talked about temperament in the days beforehand, then right in that moment when he did something that violated temperament, that's the moment there to make the connection. And, even the audience is already making the connection if they're watching for that. But instead, it all turned into after the fact, in the days afterwards, people talking about, he doesn't seem to have the temperament. These things have to be. One of the key things you learn with the importance of narrative is the amount of time you need to invest up front long before you ever get there. The planning that needs to go, the idea of strategizing. And clearly what they did that day, it was just everybody showed up, late for work and everything else like that and too busy and walked in. And then they just off the top, it's so bad.
Just kind of winged it, huh?
They completely winged it. So many of them ran out of time. Cory Booker said, I'm getting to a point. He never got to the point. I mean, just elementary principles that they clearly didn't have anybody coaching them with any narrative intuition. What can you do?
Now, you had experience with them. Well, with the Hillary campaign, the Dems had you in a few months before the election, and you sat there with James Carville. I wouldn't go that far. No, I tried to the best of my abilities. What happened? And let's take a minute to talk about that, because this is one of my formative experiences. So you mentioned this and but therefore template that I developed in 2012. You read about it in 2014, I think, and you and I have been talking about it for 4 years solid now, and you've been a great help in my developing the ideas, because we're making this stuff up as we go along to some extent. There hasn't been this template before. But as the election campaign season began, when Trump entered into the race, I began to realize something, which is that the and but therefore was derived from the thing I heard from the South Park guys, where they talked about what they call the rule of replacing. And the simple principle is the idea that you go in to any given text, and every time you see the word and, you ask yourself, could I replace this with a but or a therefore? Every time you replace an and with a but or a therefore, the storytelling gets more powerful. And that was the simple rule I set to work with. And then in 2015 began to hit me, wait a second, if you start doing that with text, you're going to end up with a simple metric. You're going to have a ratio of buts to ands. And as you remove ands and replace them with the buts, that metric will change. And it's going to be a reflection of how strong the narrative content is. So I set to work starting to just simply count the number of buts and number of ands in hundreds and hundreds of speeches and texts of all different sorts. And the pattern jumped out immediately. Starting with the famous debates between Lincoln and Douglas, you could see that for every one of those debates, Lincoln's ratio of butts to ands was way above Douglas. Douglas was just a little fire hydrant of a guy who spewed out information without much of narrative structure. Lincoln, of course, is one of the all-time great orators. And in the accounts from the newspaper reporters, they talked about how fast Douglas talked, which is what you can do when you're not structuring narrative, and how slow and thoughtful Lincoln was. So there's lots of biology that goes with this sort of stuff. And I began to look at these speeches from Trump and realized that his ratio of butts to ands was sky high, higher than any other politician. And what it means is that he's holding attention by constantly getting to these points of contradiction and points of synthesis, the therefores. And he gets to lots of therefores through his dishonesty, through his willingness to lie and say things, look, it's simple, we just build a wall. Look, it's simple, we just change the tax code, whatever. And he basically cheats the system. But it pays off with the mass audience because it keeps punching them with the word but and pulling them in and holds their attention. And he basically, I think, his level of but and the narrative content matches mainstream television, where most politicians don't. Most of them are much further down and more nuanced and going through ands and things like that. And that's why you don't ever see anybody interrupting programming to cover any of their speeches, but they did it endlessly for Trump. So as that began to happen, I began to sit up and say, oh my goodness, something's going on here. And my book came out in the fall of 2015, Houston, We Have a Narrative.
And I thought maybe that book would be enough of a entry point to get me a chance to publish an editorial about this.
But
Exactly. But I ended up going through 5 different versions of the editorial and drawing on all my contacts at all these major places, at the New York Times, at the 538 blog, at lots of other outlets, at Slate, and the publicist at University of Chicago Press tried. And every single place, they just said, it's not this simple. It's not this simple. That's all that we got, a big brick wall. It's not this simple. And in the end, I had to just sit there and spin my wheels until finally one day I was so frustrated. I sat down and searched on Google Hillary Clinton boring, because that's what I was seeing was her narrative index was less than half of Trump's. And everybody was talking about how boring her speeches were. And I searched that, and the first thing that came up was an article by an interview with James Carville, who had been the campaign manager of Bill Clinton and is really deeply gifted for narrative intuition. And if you ever watch the documentary, The War Room, that was all about his campaign with Bill Clinton, there are incredible moments in that documentary where they call him on the phone and he's in the office and Bill Clinton's out on the road and they need him to quickly come up with some little catchphrase or something. And off the top of his head, Carville, he's a great storyteller. He has the ability to boil things down to these little catchphrases. And of course, the ultimate one that he did was "It's the economy, stupid." And that's the one that really stuck. And so once I saw that, that Carville was the guy that understood what I was talking about, I wrote a letter to him. And I had a friend who was a professor at Tulane University, where he was a professor there, kind of associate professor, taught one course a year, and got my letter to him. And lo and behold, about 2 weeks later, I get this phone call out of the blue with him saying, "Hey, Randy, I read your letter here, and I'm really fascinated by this index years, how you got these numbers that Trump's double what Hillary is, because it makes sense to me." And we talked on the phone, and he was the raging Cajun live and in person. And I got about 2 solid minutes of profanity to begin with, as he was so furious about Bernie and how Bernie was screwing up the whole Democratic Party and all the chaos that he was seeing. And in fact, he was on, I think, Chris Hayes that night, repeating everything that he was shouting at me over the phone. I think he was rehearsing with me. And so he said, "Send me all your stuff and we'll try and do something." And then I didn't hear from him for a month and a half. And then suddenly I got an email from a guy who was a staffer working on Hillary Clinton's campaign. He was a young guy. We ended up doing a phone call eventually. I began telling him all this stuff, and he said they were really interested in there. And so I began sending them all these notes. Look, here's all the patterns. Here's what we can see. She's not putting enough narrative content in her speeches. Her speeches are these long-winded and things. Make a long story short, every Friday they had conference calls with the people in Brooklyn and DC. And he told me that he pitched my stuff 3 Fridays in a row. But he just said, "We're just too busy. We're too swamped. We're running flat out." And therein lies the central dilemma. My business partner, Jade Lovell, is from Australia, and she's got this great little saying from down there where they say, you don't want to be the person who's so busy digging with a spoon, you don't have time to pick up a shovel. And that's exactly what we ran into there, was that they were so flat out, so busy, so swamped. They didn't have the time to sit down and actually come up with a narrative. And they started, the whole campaign. They never had a message. That was made abundantly clear. Chuck Todd on Meet the Press in August of 2016 verbatim asked her, what's the one thing at the core of this campaign? And she just scoffed and said, "Oh, Chuck, there's no one thing. We stand for all these different things." Well, that's not mass communication. That's not understanding the need for the singular core principle. And so in the end, she lost the whole thing. I just had to watch it in slow motion. The one consolation prize I did get out of it was in the weeks after the failed election. I had lunch with Carville in New Orleans, which is a huge amount of fun. He's just one of the most entertaining guys I've ever met. He lives up to everything you expect. And then he brought me down in January last year to speak in his class. And he teaches, I think he's moved to LSU now, but at Tulane, he taught this course once a year that was one night a week. And it was in his house there just off campus. And it's like the what was her name? Anne Rice interview with the vampire, the whole little section there off of the campus, all these old mansions with the super high ceilings and like the red velvet curtains hanging down, and 50 undergraduates that they would bring in kind of like their landing foyer sort of. And then there was a staircase that went up there, really ornate staircase. And there was a landing on there. And so he and I sat up there in these 2 comfortable chairs for 2 hours with a little slide projector off to the side, and 50 incredibly bright political science majors there, and just riveted as I went through all this stuff about the narrative index and talked to them about that. And it was really great. And, there were 4 young women there who worked in Hillary's campaign. One of them in Brooklyn, she took the semester off. And they were heartbroken, as I said, that she didn't have a narrative. And they disagreed. They raised their hand and said, no, it's not true. And then later, as I got deeper into what I meant that there was no narrative, they began to realize, and when it was over, they came up to me, standing out in the balcony or in the patio in front. And they said, we realize what you're saying. You're right. Now that we think about it, she always had specific things for us, but there was no overarching message to the whole campaign. And it was so sad. But the final consolation prize of all that was he and the lawyer guy that was the co-instructor. They've been doing this course for like 10 years, I think. And they'd had 3 different former presidents in there and all kinds of different major politicians. And they took me to dinner at this local restaurant. And I got to sit there and have cocktails with the 2 of them for about 3 hours as they just held court and told stories. And all the people in the restaurant came around and wanted to hang out with it. And like as soon as you walk in the door, everybody, hey, there's the Raging Cajun. So one of the most fun nights ever. But a last little anecdote to tack onto that, because I think this needs to be told. I hope he doesn't mind me sharing this because it goes very deep. I had asked him over and over again, didn't you and Bill try and talk to her and try and steer the campaign? And, he talks to Bill every day, but he said they wouldn't listen. She wouldn't listen. Nobody would listen. And finally, he told me this little anecdote and said, look, let me just bring this to life by telling you this. In Bill Clinton's campaign, there were 3 slogans, one of which was, he's with us. So picture somebody down on the floor, an event, pointing up to the podium and at that guy and saying, that guy is with us. That was his slogan. He's with us. Well, her campaign slogan was, I'm with her. The exact opposite, down on the floor, you're pointing up and you see her up there. I'm with her. And he said, I just, twice tried to suggest to her, could you just flip that around and say she's with us? It changes the whole dynamic, and didn't register at all. And
they
so
wouldn't listen. No.
Wouldn't listen, weren't listening. And there were 2 other people in Hollywood I know also that were major people that also tried to talk to her about things. And I'm learning a lot with the politicians that when they run these campaigns, I think as soon as they announce, they put the blinders on and they've got their 1 or 2 inside people that are their trusted confidants, and they're not going to listen to much of anything outside of that for the most part. Once they hit the pedal to the metal, they're just off and running. So what can you do?
And what have you learned now that we've seen with Trump in office and his narrative intuition? At first, we covered the ABT, and now it's grown into so much more. And you've had a chance from your biology background, your science background, to really analyze how he uses this on us.
Yeah, let's run through these 5 points, because I just did this little interview with Jade Lovell on the Young Turks Network that was posted last week. And so the same thing that's in there, because I think they're very relevant. So 5 key points, starting with the slogan. And from the very beginning, he came out with this simple slogan, make America great again. And all the Democrats could think to do was ridicule it. Say, that's stupid and it's simple and it's moronic, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, well, guess what? It's 4 years later and he hasn't changed a word of it. And he's messaged around it endlessly. And he's had one clear narrative. And furthermore, you start thinking about that slogan and you realize it comes straight out of the ABT. So that's one of the traits of a good slogan is, can you feel that it's coming out of a narrative structure? So from the beginning, the basic narrative that went with his campaign was that the U.S. is a great and mighty nation, but we've slipped in the world. Therefore, it's time to make America great again. So it was a statement of consequence that is addressing what's been set up like that. And that made it very powerful and made it stick. There's what's that book, Made to Stick?
The Heath brothers.
Yeah, whatever it is. I'm sorry, but that most of that stuff is just as simple as narrative structure. If you land on good narrative structure, things stick. If you don't, they don't stick for the most part.
And in this case, and, but, and therefore, and is a setup, but is the contradiction that raises the tension within the story. And then the therefore is the payoff, the resolution.
That's right.
Why do our brains love that? Why do they, because I've been accused of the ABT being reductive and insulting, but not by very many people. And yet I've also had way more people say, oh my God, this is like the most powerful little morsel I've ever used in my communication. Why does it work?
Over the past century, as we've expanded the amount of information in our society, we've gotten caught up in obfuscation. And that's the tragedy of it all, is that people lead very complex lives and it's hard to fight against this stuff. And you end up wallowing in obfuscation and being comfortable with it. And so the gradient is built against it. But in terms of this 3-part structure, it's universal. It's incredibly broad. This is the way that we think, the way that we reason. It underpins everything. The video I made last year, I have the catchphrase, narrative is everything. When you start looking around, you see, and one of the kind of moments of discovery for that for me was a few years ago, we did a workshop with Deloitte, and they had 30 of their top guys there. And at one point in the break, I was talking about the ABT, and a guy came up to me and said, we've got this template we use for our case studies. It's situation, conflict resolution. Is this the same thing? And yeah, instantly, I'd never heard that before, but it is exactly the same thing. Well, guess what? The three forces underpin everything. So the three forces are agreement, contradiction, and consequence. And then they radiate out into all these different professions. So ABT is for this sort of communication stuff. The science world has their own form. The way that their scientific papers are required to be written follows the same 3-4 structure. You set up what we can all agree on in the past. Now we're going to talk about what's new, the contradiction, and then we're going to resolve it all together at the end. And in the world of debate and rhetoric, a buddy of mine, Jerry Graff at University of Chicago, Illinois, a professor emeritus, wrote a book there probably 10 years ago now called They Say, I Say. It's sold over 2 million copies. It's used in all the courses across the country for comparative literature and rhetoric and things like that. And think of the first two, what the title is. They Say, I Say. And by the way, I know you talk a lot about branding on this show. That's kind of at the core as much as branding is really about. It's they say, I say, okay? All these other companies, they say this is the way to make a product. I say this is the way we do it, and this is how we're different, therefore, by our product. So it's this 3-part logic that underpins everything, and even comedians, and who, by the way, are probably the most adept at this narrative structure stuff, and why they haven't been brought in more by politicians to write their speeches, not to write jokes for them, but because they understand narrative structure. If you listen to Bill Maher's show every Friday night and listen to the monologue at the end of it, and just try it yourself, count the buts and ands. I promise you, week after week, the ratio will be about 30. That's what I do, divide the buts by the ands, multiply by 100. It's just always up in the 30s, which is incredibly high. Trump averaged 29, Hillary was down at 14. Yada, yada.
What should we aspire to in regular communication, business communication? If I'm writing a blog post or doing a proposal or whatever, and I go and I do my narrative index, what would be the tipping point?
Yeah, good question. And it's not essential. You can write something really compelling, and it can have not even have the word "but" in there at all. But overall, you'll see this pattern emerge. And in general, under 10 is pretty dang boring. Between 10 and 20 is kind of normal. Getting over 20 is what you see in some of the better orators over time. When you look at the speeches of John F. Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King, they're all right around 20. And then some of these incredible speeches, Barbara Jordan's keynote speech at the 1976 Democratic Convention that's held up as one of the top 10 best speeches in American history, I think has a score of a 36. Michael Crichton's tremendous speech to the American Association of Advancement of Science, that I quote from all the time, is about a 35. So when people are really into problem solution mode, they end up with a pretty high up into the 30s. And then, you can get all the way up in the 40s if you really go cuckoo with it. If you look at Michelle Wolf gave that incredible performance at the correspondence dinner, and I got the transcript of that, and I think that was like a 46 or something, because that's what comedians do.
Comedians, yeah.
You can't survive as a comedian if you're not using narrative structure really tightly.
So I take my buts and my howevers and whatever, something that's introducing contradiction, and divide it by my ands, which is ands are exposition, meaning I'm just going on to set up a point that I never make if I don't get to that button. Therefore, I divide the buts by the ands and then times it by 100, and whatever that number comes up is where
that's it.
My communication lands on the narrative index.
As I say, it's a fairly rough approximation, but if you do it from multiple documents and you start to see a pattern, there's definitely something going on.
Yeah. So Trump's got this down. America used to be great, but America is no longer great. Therefore, I'm going to make America great again. If you're really to boil it down, landed on his theme of make America great again. He had this narrative index that often scores above 30 plus.
Yes, right.
And then he comes at us and he throws these insult names, all over the place. He insults everybody,
Yep.
Pocahontas and Little Marco and this sort. What is that about, and how does it play to his overall narrative thinking?
Okay, so I said I was going to go through 5 traits, so let's itemize them. So the first one is the slogan, and then the second one is that narrative index that we're talking here, but he scores very high on that.
Gotcha.
The third one is the singular narrative, and there was a best-selling book written in 2012, I think, called The One Thing, and everybody should be familiar with that book. It's not a tremendously detailed text, but it lands on that's it. That's a crucial element of communication is the one thing, the singular narrative. Can you boil this thing down? That's what I was saying about the Kavanaugh hearing. If they could have just picked the one thing of temperament, you benefit from that. And Trump has just a deep intuitive ability to do that. I don't think he could analytically explain to you how he does any of these things. He's not a cerebral guy. He just has a deep intuition when it comes to communication. And that manifests itself there, which is the one name insults are incredibly powerful and they stick. And so exactly, Lying Ted and Little Marco and Crooked Hillary and Pocahontas, and most recently, the failing New York Times. These labels don't go away because they're so simple. And this is the same thing as stereotypes. And the minorities figured this out a long time ago, that you can't let these things stand. But the Democratic Party just seems to lack this understanding of it. Because as soon as he started with those one name insult names, everybody should have risen up and said, we're not going to put up with this. This is the same thing that the stereotyping does. You're boiling people down to this thing, number one. And number two, if they're not going to rise up against it, the least they could have done was come up with their own one word insult name for him.
That's what I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
Why don't they do that?
Why?
They're probably afraid they don't want to get down the mud with him.
I know. Such is the madness that I'm forced to endure on a daily basis as I watch this. And you can find 100 editorials in all of these great websites and everything that are opining day in and day out that all have different names for them. But they don't seem to have the ability to come together. Can we agree on one? Because if you got 100 names, you might as well have no name. That's how this narrative stuff works. It's about the singular narrative. And let me toss in an aside on that is incredibly powerful for your listeners. There's a great article by Nicholas Kristof, 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner from the New York Times, in Outside Magazine of all places in 2009, November 2009. I use this endlessly in my workshops. And you should just search that on the internet. Very simple. Nicholas Kristof, starts with a K, and Outside Magazine will take you right to it. It's called Nicholas Kristof's Advice, Saving the World. And that's such a powerful article because it's very short and simple, but he pulls together some social psychology research with general patterns that he's witnessed. And I spoke to him a few years ago, interviewed him for one of my books, and great guy. And he said, yeah, that's one of the most popular things ever written, go figure, Outside Magazine. But what it was he and his wife spent a number of years in Africa working on one health issue. I think it was iodide shortage in villages. And they got to see all these World Health Organization public education campaigns come and go. And the vast majority of them failed. And they began to see some of these patterns of what explained what worked and what didn't. And in there, he talks about this idea of the singular narrative. And the way he presents it is he talks about, imagine that you run a campaign to get people to donate money to the efforts to combat a disease. And in your advertisement, you have a picture of one little girl in a village in Uganda, and you say that she's going to die next year unless we can get the resource in there to help out. People will get motivated. Now, if you add in a second photo of another little girl there, wouldn't you think people get twice as motivated? Now there's 2 people at stake here instead of just one. Well, as you know, that doesn't happen, because if it's 5 and then it's 10 and it's 100 and eventually it's 1,000,000. And the age-old quote that he mentions in there is, the death of one person is a tragedy. The death of 1,000,000 is a statistic. And that's this inverse relationship between storytelling and sample size, basically. And story is at its most powerful when it's down to the power of one, and that connects with that book, The One Thing. And this is what I'm trying to explain to the science world nowadays, is the fundamental programming flaw that they've got is when you're raised as a scientist, as I was a marine biologist. I did my PhD at Harvard and got tenure as a biology professor. You are trained so deeply to worship sample size. And you listen to these studies, and if they've got a sample size of 5, you scoff. And if it's 50, you start to take interest. And if it's 500, oh, yeah. And if it's 5,000,000, oh my good, are you kidding me? And it's just so deep in the intuition of a scientist to believe that a larger sample size is more powerful. That leaves them really at a loss how to understand this idea that no, actually storytelling is the exact inverse. It's at its most powerful when it's all the way down to the one, the single individual. And therein lies the problem. Whether you get these scientists, I work with them all the time at Genentech and with the American Association of Advancement Science, and they are proud in their presentations that they've got 8 different experiments they're going to present, and more and more and more. And they do not understand this idea of less being more. So it's a real battle with them at times, and that underpins. I think it underpins a lot of the thinking of the Democratic Party. I mean, that was exactly what Hillary Clinton had said on Meet the Press, was that I've got all these different great things we're working for. I know that's good, but can you find the one overarching theme to wrap them all into? And that's what Trump did once again. And so then that takes us from that third point of the insult names to the fourth point, which is the one word theme. So not only the slogan of Make America Great Again, but in my Houston book, I presented this template in there that we're beginning to learn in our training programs is the most powerful of all. It's called the Dobzhansky template. And it's basically fill in the blank sentence in which nothing in blank makes sense except in the light of blank. And what's the one thing that's going to explain everything? And that turns out to be a really good exercise for, if you've got a company or something like that, it's a simple thing to do. Nothing in our business makes sense except in the light of packaging. We've brought this unique way to make packaging, who knows what, whatever it is. And so Trump solved that equation from the very beginning with the one word, and his one word was greatness. And that's what's in the slogan, Make America Great Again. And that has been his theme from start to finish today. And, he's constant, every speech, he's messaging around greatness. He knows what his one theme is. And that leads us then to the fifth final trait there that's super important, which is confidence. And this comes right out of the world of literature, which is that there's this thing called the omniscient narrator. And it's an age-old tradition in literature, for the masses, for people reading novels and things like that, or movies, which is that as a member of the mass audience, not as an intellectual, not as a PhD, but as somebody out there working in a factory, you want your narrators to always be confident, know exactly what they're telling you. And you are more concerned about them being confident and consistent than you are about being accurate. And therein lies a lot of the dilemma with this fake news stuff today, is that because of the information explosion and combined with the social media explosion, people are shifting from substance to style, and style being these narratives, these larger scale organizations of information. And as a result, they're just wanting consistency more. And they're drawn to the guy who's confident like that. And there's one thing you can say about Trump, he is supremely confident no matter what he's saying. And he sticks to his guns, even if he's insulting McCain or insulting people with handicaps or who knows what, he just doesn't back down. And that has an impact over time. And that's coming out of narrative tradition. It's not something you can analyze out of today's events and things like that. This is long-term stuff deeply programmed into the whole psyche and in story.
And that's where the the gaslighting comes in too, when he can stand up there and tell a bold-faced lie, but be so confident in it that all of a sudden smart people are like, well, wait a minute, what is true? No, that can't be true. But wait a second, he said, it was with such strength, it must be.
Well, and that leads me to my concern of today, and the biggest of all scales, which is that we're in a different society now. And 1999, Michael Crichton, the author of Jurassic Park, who was an incredibly bright guy, he too had a science career that he left to go to Hollywood. And in 1994, he became the first person to ever have simultaneous #1 book, movie, and TV show. I think he had ER, and I think maybe it was Rising Sun was the book, and Disclosure was, I don't know which of the three it was. You can find his Wikipedia page, but nobody knew more about the media world than he did from an analytical perspective. And he tried to help the science world. He gave speeches in which he offered up advice. But because he was in Hollywood, they could never take him seriously. They always thought, oh, that's crazy, wacky Hollywood movie man. So in 1999, he gave a final big address to the American Association of Advancement of Science, several thousand people there. And the guy who invited him, Mike Strauss, you've met him, my buddy from USDA. He was working at AAAS back then. And he's told me about how that whole thing went, which was that Crichton gave this incredible speech. You can find it online. It was so prescient. He warned of these are the things that are coming. When the information starts exploding, there's going to be these consequences. And the quote that I cite endlessly from him now that was so prescient was he said, the information society will favor those who are most skilled at manipulating the media. there couldn't have been a more clear prediction of Donald Trump, a guy coming out of The Apprentice and TV world and understanding the media and knowing how to manipulate it. And he's a manifestation of the information society today. So my question for broader society is, all of these news shows that you watch now, Meet the Press and Face the Nation and everything on MSNBC and even Fox News, they're constantly bringing on historians to talk about the past. But why aren't they bringing on people to talk about the information society and to say things are different today? These things are cute and nice from the past, but it wasn't the same world back then. We've got a different world now, and it's favoring different people. And this is why Trump has had such an easy go of it. He understands at an intuitive level how the stuff works, how the news cycle works and everything else. And my premise is that the traditional guardians of our society are the journalists and the historians, and they've done a good job of keeping an eye on these politicians. But this guy didn't come up through the traditional political channels. He came out of entertainment media and even Hollywood, and they do not understand entertainment media. And they just don't. Journalists do not. It's an age-old source of humor in Hollywood, as journalists come in there and constantly baffled and mystified by how the movie business works.
Well, you got pushback from a few prominent journalists of saying it just can't be this easy, Randy. You're missing something here.
God, that is very true. Last year, I got attacked on Twitter by a Pulitzer Prize winner who said that verbatim. He said that he was
Dan Fagan.
Yes, Dan Fagan, who I thought was my buddy. He hosted me about 5 years ago at NYU Journalism School.
You must have pissed him off.
Well, yeah, exactly. So here's what he tweeted at me. He said, I had just done a blog post talking about these simple principles that underlie a lot of Trump's narrative intuition. And he said, I have no patience at all for this kind of hyper-reductionism. And then he said, no one thought Trump would win, including him. You need finer tip brushes for this kind of painting. I get that you're doing your, quote, this is the key stuff to make an interesting point. But as usual, people are more complicated, even him. Well, that's nice, but not when we're talking about these communication dynamics.
Yeah, it's not complication. It's simplification.
Yes.
And you can just see his entire platform, how simple it is. So from your evolutionary biology background, why does our brain want it simpler? I mean, that's a whole other show.
Well, the first answer I'll give you that is we're generally, in my evolutionary biology training, we're generally trained to not address why questions. They bring with them too much metaphysical and deeper meaning and things like that. You might want to ask the question of how could we have been selected for more simple things, and I think maybe that turns it back onto that our brains have not evolved in 4,000 years very much. It just. This natural selection takes too long for us to suddenly get different shapes and sizes of brains in just that many generations. And so we are still processing information, that same storytelling. Well, this is the point that everybody's making nowadays about how primal story is that you can see in the cuneiform tablets of Gilgamesh, the early form of storytelling all the way back then. So we have been and but therefore all along, and we've built through technology, science has unleashed on us all this new stuff to spin our heads around. But at the end of the day, it keeps coming back to the way that the brain works, which is this basic three parts, which are basically setup, problem, and solution. And that's the bottom line, is that what's his name? Jonathan Gottschall had a nice book called The Storytelling Animal.
I love that book.
Yeah, great book. But, if I were to redo it, I would title it The Problem-Solving Animal, because that's what's really at the core of our brain. And that's the core of the brain of every animal. That's all you do. If you're a lizard, you spend the whole day solving problems. You got two main things. How am I going to eat? How am I going to reproduce? And so why wouldn't everything be built around this basic dynamic of setup, problem, solution? Okay, I feel some hunger. There's my setup. Now I've got a problem. I got to get some food, and now I'm going to solve it. And that is what's at the core of storytelling, as you've detailed in a lot of the talks that you've given, is that the whole hero's journey at its core is just the problem solution dynamic. Murder mysteries and every journey and everything like that is endlessly problem solution.
Yeah, and so it's funny, we have two competing brains, at least in my mind, my messed up mind. We have the cerebral cortex that is creating this massive amount of information and the technology to deliver it. So we're creating the Moore's law of compounding complexity on how we publish and take in this information. And yet we are still running around like we're on the savannah with how we actually process that information in our limbic system. So Well, folks like Fagan can say, oh, no, it's much more complicated than that. And, come on, winning a Pulitzer Prize is no easy feat. So that's a complicated process in its own right.
Yeah,
To
but
get that.
Mark, let me ask you something. What if there was a Nobel Prize winner who could actually supersede the authority of a Pulitzer?
You might be talking about Paul Romer.
I think that's today's topic of the day. Exactly.
It is. Yep.
Yeah, this morning when Park and I talked, I hadn't even made the connection, but it's really wonderful. So Paul Romer was the chief economist at the World Bank. And in spring of, I think, 2000 and maybe last year or 2016, they had a whole big brouhaha there that the economists talked about. And it's wonderful because it rises right out of what I'm talking about here, which is that, it arose from a study done by something called the Stanford Literary Lab in 2015. And what they did was the World Bank, their annual reports are legendary for being unreadable, for being bank speak, it's called, and just being incredibly boring. So they took the annual World Bank reports going all the way back to the 1940s and did a very simple thing. They just counted the word and calculated the percentage of all words in the entire document that were the word and the patterns, just like I'm talking about this but-and ratio. I mean, this stuff is going to grow very soon. People are going to get onto this and realize how much we can understand about language by looking at these two keywords in particular, and but. And so what they found for this percentage of ands, which I refer to now as just the and index, back in the 1940s, when things were moving more slowly and people were more efficient, it converged around an average of 2.5. And there's actually, if you start to look at frequencies of word usage in the language, there's reason for that. And in fact, to this day, if you, as we've done, take a bunch of articles that are well edited from the New Yorker or the New York Times or anything like that, they all converge right around 2.5% of all the words are and. It's incredibly consistent kind of reference point there. But what you see with the World Bank was that year after year, the percentages began to creep up and up and up and up. And they're using more and stuff as they're just tacking together stuff. And back then in the 40s, the reports were put together by, a committee of just a few people that all knew what they were doing. Today, they are edited and glued together, just tons and tons of people all throwing in stuff. There's no overarching editing eye going on with the thing, creating any sort of a narrative. And as a result, the reports now get to be upwards of 6 to 7% of all the words in the report are the word and. So
it's exposition. It's and exactly. They never get to a point.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's just gluing together whole pieces of information without making a point, because that's what contradiction is used to make points here. Look at all this, but what if we think about this? And so Paul Romer was hired as the chief economist at the World Bank, and he saw that Stanford Literary Lab report, and he said, this is an outrage. And so he put out an internal memo that said, I want these reports to come back down to 2.5%. And I'm going to stop approving the release of reports unless the and percentage is 2.5%. Well, the old guard there rose up in arms against him, furious. And it got so vicious that they got him booted off the committee that he was the head of, that he was trying to do that from. And by the time I tried to get in touch with him to interview him, this was just last year, I think, in The Economist, he wouldn't answer my emails. And finally, the information officer there talked to him and then wrote back to me and said, there's a lot of bad feelings around this experience, and he doesn't want to talk about it any further. So I didn't get any comment out of him. But lo and behold, this morning you open up the news, and there he just got the Nobel Prize.
He wins the Nobel Prize.
Yes,
so
exactly.
There you go.
Yay!
You've got your Nobel against your Pulitzer anytime.
There you go. There's a victory for the forces of simplicity. Yay!
Now, we've seen, and I've had on the show over the last couple of weeks, some really creative, interesting political ads. I had Patrick Hunt from Hunt Adkins out of Minnesota on here about a month ago. They did the amazing Bigfoot spot that you were the first one to bring my attention to it for Dean Phillips running for Congress. And it is hysterical. It's beautiful. I got a chance to get Patrick on the show to talk about what went into the thinking and the strategy behind that and how they arrived at it. And then just last week, I had a local director producer here, Randy Murray, who did the amazing campaign for going against Paul Gosar. When Paul Gosar, 6 of his siblings come out in the spot and say, don't vote for our brother.
I saw that.
So I'm not hugely political on this show, but we just have had so many interesting storytelling things going on with these midterms and with the Kavanaugh nomination and that sort of thing. You have since applied the ABT to some campaign slogans that you're seeing in the midterms out there. Take us through that quickly, if you would, on how are you using that to identify what you believe is a good slogan versus a bad slogan?
Yeah, so let's begin with I was saying about the three underlying forces of the ABT. So the words themselves are and, but, and therefore, but the forces beneath them are agreement, contradiction, and consequence. So we set up an argument by here's what we can all agree on. Then you start the argument, but here's the contradiction to everything. And then you resolve it at the end with the statement of consequence. This is what we're actually going to do. This is how we're going to solve it. This is how we're going to go to work. Well, think that through. Which of those three elements do you think would make for a good slogan? Just and agreement. We can all agree on that's not very powerful. Or just the problem. People get sick of that. All right, what are you going to do about it? It turns out what you want for a slogan is a statement of consequence. And it began to dawn on me. Here's a great simple little test for you to use for any given slogan, which is just say the word therefore and then say your slogan. And you'll feel if it's good or not. If you have a slogan and you say something like, therefore, just do it.
Therefore, think different.
Think different. It rolls off the tongue and you start to see this thing. So in the segment I did for Young Turks Network last week with Jade, we took 18 of these current campaign slogans, people running for Congress, and went through them one after another, and they run the whole spectrum. A lot of them are just and statements. They're just dull statements of fact, which is not wrong. There's just no life to it. But a few of them are really powerful and punchy. In your state there of Arizona, you've got Martha McSally running against Kristen Sinema. And Martha McSally, the Republicans, a military veteran, she's got two slogans, actually. They're both, one of them is make no mistake, and the other one, I think, is stand with her. So they're both really confident statements. And they roll okay off the word, therefore, make no mistake. It's just not very specific, so it's not that powerful, but it's not bad. But Kristen Sinema's slogan on our website, all I could find was, and if you say the word therefore, it's therefore an independent voice for Arizona. That's not narrative. That's just a statement of who she is. And you kind of want something more that maybe even reflects back to what we're going against. Now, if you want to see a couple of A-level slogans who are probably have got A-plus communications teams working with them because it's such a heated race, it's Beto O'Rourke versus Ted Cruz in Texas. And Beto's slogan is, therefore, Texas deserves better. That's great. That's an excellent slogan. Simple, punchy. It's the kind of thing you could imagine somebody at work angry in the middle of the day and thinking, man, we deserve better than this. Furthermore, a good slogan, you could feel the ABT that came before it. Politics can do great things, but right now we've got a bunch of really mediocre politicians. Therefore, Texas deserves better. So it fits right into the narrative flow of things. His only problem is that Ted's got an equally good slogan, which is therefore tough as Texas. And that's actually probably resonating with the don't mess with Texas slogan. And you can feel the ABT of that. Politics is a great little thing to do, but sometimes Washington, D.C. can get ugly and mean. Therefore, we need a politician or a senator who's tough as Texas.
So it seems like that's very close to Sinema's an independent voice for Arizona. How do you see the difference in those two?
Oh, independent voice is just kind of flat. I mean, yeah, tough is a word that's, you're talking about with Ted Cruz versus her?
Yeah. If I'm just comparing now these two taglines, two slogan lines.
I think that the Ted Cruz one has got a more human feeling word with tough. Yeah, there's a feel to that. And as I say, it resonates with don't mess with Texas. So there's an attitude to it. There's a bunch of human elements to that as well. An independent voice for Arizona is just kind of a statement. And a lot of these campaign slogans are just statements. And as I said, it's not that they're bad. It's just that they don't convey very much when it's just a statement of. Yeah.
So let's go to Dean Phillips' Bigfoot spot.
Well,
you said it was the best spot you've seen since Rainier beer commercials, which I grew up on in Seattle.
Well, that sort of says something about me and how old I am and everything like that, nostalgic. But it's so clever and fun and catchy and perfectly executed and just hilarious. And it's the kind of thing you just want to watch multiple times and show to your friends because it's so fun. And it brings in that spirit of fun, which is really great. And by the way, you go to their website and they've got a great slogan. Their slogan is, therefore, everyone's invited. and very simple and punchy. And that's their goal, is they want to pull away people from the other guy. And they just want to make it clear that everybody's welcome in their campaign because the other guy's really divisive. And
well, and he disappears. He's 5-term Republican in Minnesota. That's Eric Paulson, and he doesn't show up for town hall meetings, and his constituents can't find him.
Yeah, but wait. No, I saw him in that commercial. He's at the lobbying place.
They said, Bigfoot out to see if he could spot him because he was so surprised that someone could be so rare.
That's
therefore, their slogan plays right off of that too. So you can imagine what the setup is.
That's a brilliant commercial. And another slogan that I love right now, not a campaign, it's the national thing that Democratic activists are running called Swing Left, where they've identified all these different districts that have the potential to swing from being red to blue. And their slogan, which I absolutely love, is "Don't despair, mobilize." Perfect.
Therefore, don't despair, mobilize.
Exactly. A statement of consequence, enough with the whining. You can feel the ABT before it, we lost to Trump, but it's not going to help anything to sit around depressed. Therefore, don't despair, mobilize, get to work. These things.
They're using the ABT big time. They even just produced or published a video, a how-to video for their volunteers on how to use the ABT to tell a better story.
Yes. And it's a wonderful video. It's on their website. Everybody should check that out. And that's really nice because that's what's going on. Is it's been 6 years now pounding away on this thing. And the past year, we're starting, the dam is starting to break, despite some of these intellectuals who say this is too simple. There have been some major developments. The largest climate organization on the planet, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, put out their communications handbook this last spring, and they did a full page on the and but therefore template and cited it back to me. National Park Service, which we work with a lot now, is using it for their reports as their template for their case studies. And so lots of these big organizations are picking up on it.
Well, now you've got a connection with William Nordhaus, the other Nobel Prize winner today. His was on economics and the impact on the climate. So it seems like you can triangulate Romar Nordhaus and the IPCC with the ABT ASAP.
We can only hope.
So what are your predictions for the midterms? Who's going to win out? Who do you think's telling a better story, the Republicans or the Dems?
The Republicans have got a big, loud narrative voice up there at the top, and it's a booming voice, and it speaks narrative. And
give me a butt. You just give me 3 ands.
Okay. Wait, you want a butt for optimism?
Whatever the contradiction is.
Yeah, I'm very, very concerned that a lot of these Democratic candidates they aren't grasping the power of narrative and going at it like this. And I don't think that they're talking about the blue wave. And it's very clear what just happened with the Kavanaugh thing has been a big boost to the whole Trump side of it all. And in the end, one of the fundamental principles they pounded into our heads in film school. I went to USC Cinema School, after I left my science career. And from the beginning, one of the things they would say is story will out. And what that means is, you may have a film that's got a bunch of nudity in it, and overnight it's, everybody wants to see it. But does it tell a good story? Because if it doesn't, it's not going to last that long. It's just going to be a flash in the pan. And it's the things, and the ultimate proof of that is the South Park guys. Look at their show in, what is it, the 22nd or 23rd season? The only thing that has kept that massively successful is their incredible ability to year after year, week after week, tell really tight stories. Every one of their episodes, they've got this down. They're the guys that I picked up the ABT from, although I got to add in there that I actually tracked it back to the 1980s to Frank Daniel, the screenwriting guru, who talked about the importance of these 3 words, and, but, and therefore. So that's where the South Park guys, Matt Stone and Trey Parker, have distinguished themselves. And I think they'd be the first ones to say that anybody could have thought up the idea of foul-mouthed little kids for an animated series in the mid-90s. The question is, do you have the ability to demonstrate exactly that thing they told us? Story will out, and they have outed, they've persisted because they've got that ability to tell stories.
Well, yesterday I was out at the Four Seasons up in Troon in northern Scottsdale. I was working with a past client of mine, Forever Living Products, which is a multi-billion-dollar global company that sells aloe vera health and beauty products. And I was taking their leaders. They have 50 leaders, their global leadership team from around the world, representing 13 different countries through a Business of Story workshop. And of course, in all of my workshops, I always begin with the ABT. Now, picture this room. I got 50 of them in there. I got another, 10, 15 from corporate. They're sitting in here. I set up the whole ABT, show them Cartman. And of that group, maybe 2% knew of Cartman and South Park. But once I got through the ABT and they worked their template, and by the way, it was being translated real time in 8 different languages.
Whoa.
In the room. So while I'm presenting, I have to talk over top of all of these translators because it wasn't these earbud translators. They literally were sitting right next to these leaders. And so it was like, boy, these people are frustrated. But no, they weren't. They were just trying to translate what I was telling them. I can tell you universally, that group, even through their translators, understood the and, but, and therefore. They recognized it as an archetype, an architecture in their brain that worked.
Yep.
And then they wrote their stories. And I'm telling you, from Brazil to the Middle East to Japan to America, South America, that I heard these ABTs done over and over again. And to me, it just underscored how universal it is as a storytelling construct for our brains, for us Homo sapiens. And I think, as I mentioned to you, to me anyways, the ABT is literally the DNA of story structure. Start with that.
Yeah.
And the rest of your story will unfold before you.
And I will add to that international flavor. My Houston, we have a narrative book just came out in translations both into Chinese and Japanese. And then a month ago, I spent a week in Mexico City at Ibero-American University. They hosted me. And there, it was mostly in Espanol, and they translated the ABT into y pero por lo tanto. Which means and but thus. And sure enough. And they got it. Oh, God, we had 4 afternoons of ABT workshops and discussions. There's so many stories I can tell about just that week alone. All these moments of realization. One guy came in, I gave 4 or 3 lectures every morning for 2 hours. And the third one, this guy came in and said, last night I explained my whole research project to my wife. And for the first time ever, she understood it. Thanks.
She got it.
Yeah.
Well, now I know what the hell you do, honey.
Yes.
Okay.
Kind of that simple. So yeah, it's really very gratifying. And of course, it's at the core of the Story Circles training program that I run now. And we've involved over 1,000 scientists and communicators in that program now. And it's spreading rapidly with major organizations and yada, yada, yada. But it's the implementation. At the end of the Houston book, it was what I sketched out. I said, it seems to me that here's what you need to do. Once you see the power of the ABT, you don't learn it in one afternoon. You then have to go to the gym basically and start lifting weights. It's a tool like a dumbbell, as you say. Yeah. And what Story Circles is 10 one-hour sessions that go once a week, ideally, with 5 people in the session. And each 1-hour session is a super tightly structured workout that is done almost the same way each week. And the first few weeks, it's confusing them, and then they start to get it. And then by session 6, 7, 8, we start to see the beginnings of narrative intuition, where they're no longer have to look at the notes and they know exactly how the thing goes. And it's really a joy.
Yeah. Helps you build your storytelling muscles so you can take on the Trumps of the world and overthrow them and their narrative intuition.
Well, that's what needs to happen with this Democratic Party. Yeah. That's the bottom line, is that they haven't had a narrative. They don't have any leadership. They are absolutely adrift and a disaster. And somebody's got to get in there and explain some of these core principles to them. And there's just no way they should have held that hearing of Kavanaugh without some sort of strategy that morning that they pulled together. And it's clear from the transcript, there was zero strategy going on. If nothing else, it is this simple. Just give us a beginning, middle, and an end to what you're going to do. They could have done that. But if nobody points that out, it's not going to happen on its own.
And folks, if you want to learn more about the ABT, the absolute best book on it is Randy's book, Houston. We have a narrative, Why Science Needs Story. I refer all of my clients to it because it shows them in the science world how to use it, and you just easily translate it over to the business world. Also, Randy writes a terrific blog post, and I asked him why he never promotes this, and you told me, he said, because, well, this is just kind of fodder for my next book. But Folks, for the inside view, go to scienceneedsstory.com and you will just have a raft of information on how to use the ABT to help clarify your story, to amplify your impact, and simplify your life.
And, Park, you have been my fellow traveler for the last 5 years on this ABT journey as we've been learning things. And just a little side note, one thing that I've really solidified now is the and element of an ABT. It's pretty clear. You see this now a lot. There's two key elements you want to address in the and thing. You want the ordinary world, what we're talking about here in general, and then you want what's at stake. Why is this important? And you start to see it all over the place when people are communicating effectively. They do a good job of getting us into what this thing is, why it's important, and now why there's a problem.
Yeah. And the way I share it with folks is, I've been in the advertising marketing world for 35 years and have helped a lot of purpose-driven brands grow through the influence of mass media. But technology completely changed that. Now the masses are the media and they own your story. Therefore, I now consult, teach, coach, and speak on how to use proper story structure so that you can connect with people, stand out in a very loud, noisy world, be heard, and actually move them to action.
Yay.
Randy, thanks so much for being here, man.
You betcha.
Always enjoy talking with you.
Always fun.
Thank you, and thank you all for listening to this edition. If you found it as fascinating as I always do talking to Randy, please share it with some friends and family or people that are just scratching their head wondering what in the world is happening in Washington, D.C. This is a good explanation, and you're getting it from both the left and right side of the brains with Randy being a PhD, Harvard evolutionary biologist, so we got that left brain working, but then a graduate of USC Film School with 3 documentaries under his belt and 3 books on helping scientists do a better job of communicating through the power of story. So I can't think of a better intersection, a guy that can bring you both facets of story structure, brain structure, and why this stuff works to help us move our missions forward. So if I could be of service to you, track me down at businessofstory.com. I've got a ton of tools, tips, and techniques there that you can download. And join us next week when we'll have another amazing story artist on, like Randy. And until then, remember, the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one.
Can I add one last thing, Park? In the meanwhile, you and I will be working on our narrative of the Democratic Party titled For Lack of a Story.
For lack of a story, the world was lost. There you go.
It's terrible.
Sleep tight, everyone.